The first time my husband introduced me as his housekeeper, I smiled. Not because it was funny. Because I honestly believed he was joking. We had been married for 9 years. Long before he became the successful businessman everyone admired, we were just two young people sharing a tiny one-bedroom apartment. He worked during the day while trying to build his company at night, and I took on extra jobs to make sure our bills were paid. There were months when we couldn't afford to eat out. There were birthdays we celebrated with homemade cake because that was all we could manage. I never complained. Every spare pound we had went back into his business. If he needed to travel for a meeting, we found the money somehow. I even postponed finishing my degree because one of us had to keep working while he chased his dream. When the business finally began to grow, I felt just as proud as he did. It wasn't only his success. It was ours. A few years later, we moved into a beautiful house in one of the nicest parts of the city. He bought me a new car, insisted I stop working, and told me I deserved to enjoy life after everything we had been through. I believed him. I spent my days managing our home, organizing his schedule when he forgot things, hosting family dinners, and making sure everything behind the scenes ran smoothly. People often told me how lucky I was to have such a successful husband. I smiled every time I heard it. They never knew how much of that success had been built inside our tiny apartment, when nobody else believed in him. Looking back now, I think that's what hurt the most. When we had nothing. He was always proud to call me his wife. As the company became more successful, my husband's life began to change. At first, it was little things. He started buying expensive suits instead of the simple shirts he used to wear. He spent more time with investors, executives, and business partners than he did with family. Our weekends together slowly disappeared, replaced by conferences, networking dinners, and business trips. I understood. His company was growing, and I wanted him to succeed. Whenever he apologized for being busy, I reminded that I believed in him just as much as I always had. But something else changed. Whenever we attended company events, he stopped introducing me the way he used to. In the early years, he would proudly say, "This is my wife." She believed in me before anyone else did. I loved hearing those words. Then they became shorter. "This is my wife, Emily." Eventually, there were evenings when he introduced everyone in the room except me. I found myself standing beside him while he spoke enthusiastically about directors, investors, and managers, only to realize the conversation had moved on before anyone even knew who I was. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking it. After all, he always held my hand when we got home. He always thanked me for supporting him. Surely it wasn't intentional. Then one afternoon, he came home looking more excited than I had seen him in years. "Our biggest investors are flying in next Friday," he said. "This dinner could change everything for the company." I smiled and congratulated him. Then I asked the question that seemed obvious. "What time should I be ready?" For just a second, he hesitated. It was only a moment. But after 9 years of marriage, I noticed it. He looked away for a moment before answering. For the first time in our marriage, he seemed nervous about saying something to me. After a long pause, he admitted that he didn't think I should attend the dinner. At first I laughed because I thought he was joking. I had been by his side at the company events for years, so the idea of being left behind didn't even seem possible. But he wasn't smiling. He explained that this dinner was different. Important investors would be there, people who cared about appearances and expected a certain image from the company's leadership. I listened, waiting for him to make sense. Instead, every sentence made me feel more confused. He kept talking about the business, the guests, and how important the evening would be, but none of it explained why his own wife suddenly didn't belong there. When I asked what changed, he avoided the question. He simply said the company was in a different place now. Something about those words stayed with me. It wasn't just the dinner he was talking about. Somewhere along the way, his success had changed the way he saw me. Then, just as I was beginning to accept that I wouldn't be attending, he told me he still wanted me there. Relief washed over me for only a moment. He quickly explained that the catering company was short-staffed and thought I could help welcome guests, serve drinks, and keep the evening running smoothly. I stared at him, expecting him to laugh. He never did. That was the moment I realized he wasn't asking me to attend the event as his wife. He was asking me to work there. I barely slept that night. Part of me wanted to believe I had misunderstood him. Maybe he simply meant that I would help greet the guests before joining everyone else for dinner. It wouldn't have been the first time I'd stepped in when one of his events was short-staffed. So I pushed the conversation to the back of my mind. The following week, the house became busier than usual. Florists arrived with fresh arrangements, caterers came to inspect the venue, and his assistant called almost every hour to confirm one detail after another. I threw myself into the preparations, just as I always did. I checked the table settings, made sure the guest list matched the seating plan, and even noticed a mistake in the menu cards that nobody else had caught. Everyone thanked me. Everyone except my husband. He was constantly on the phone, moving from one meeting to another, barely noticing how much work had already been done before the guests arrived. On the afternoon of the dinner, I laid my dress on the bed and started getting ready. Just as I reached for my jewelry, there was a knock on the bedroom door. My husband walked in carrying 2 garment bags. Without saying a word, he placed it on the bed. "I picked this up for you." I smiled, assuming he had bought me a new evening dress. When I unzipped the bag, my smile disappeared. Inside was a neatly pressed black and white uniform. The same uniform every member of the catering staff would be wearing that evening. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. I kept hoping there was another dress hidden underneath. There wasn't, and that was when I realized he hadn't asked me to help. He had already decided what my place would be. I looked up at him, waiting for him to laugh. Waiting for him to say he had bought the wrong bag. Waiting for him to say the real dress was in the car. None of those things happened. He simply reminded me that the guests would start arriving at 7 and that the catering manager would explain what needed to be done. For a few seconds, I couldn't even find the words to respond. This was the same man who used to introduce me with pride, who once told everyone I was the reason he never gave up when his business was close to falling. Now he was asking me to spend the evening serving drinks to people who had no idea I was his wife. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask him if he had completely lost his mind. Instead, I quietly zipped the garment bag shut and placed it back on the bed. He seemed relieved that I wasn't making a scene. He kissed me and thanked me for understanding, and walked out of the room as if he had asked me for the smallest favor in the world. I stood there for several minutes after he left. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every room around me had been decorated with things we had chosen together. Every photograph on the walls reminded me of the life we had built from nothing. Yet I had never felt more like a stranger in my own home. An hour later, I put on the uniform. Because a part of me still hoped there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Maybe once the guests arrived, he would introduce me properly. Maybe he would realize how hurtful this was before anyone else noticed. I held on to that hope all the way to the ballroom. It disappeared the moment the first guests walked through the door. The ballroom filled quickly. Some of the biggest names in the industry walked through the doors, laughing as they greeted one another. Investors flew in from different countries, senior executives exchanged business cards, photographers moved from table to table capturing every important moment. I stayed near the entrance, carrying a tray of drinks as I had been instructed. Every few minutes, someone thanked me politely before walking away without a second glance. None of them recognized me. Why would they? To them, I was simply another member of the staff. I kept telling myself the evening would change once my husband had a chance to speak to everyone. Surely he wouldn't let the night end without introducing me. About an hour later, I saw him walking towards a group of important investors. He looked confident. Relaxed. One of the investors noticed me standing nearby with a tray. He smiled politely before turning to my husband. "Your home is beautiful," he said. "And your staff have been wonderful all evening." My husband thanked him with a smile. The investor looked directly at me. "I don't think we've met." Before I could open my mouth, my husband answered for me. "Oh," he smiled so naturally that nobody questioned it. "She's our housekeeper." For a moment, the entire room seemed to disappear. I couldn't hear the music anymore. I couldn't hear the conversations around me. I only heard those 4 words echoing in my head. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked shocked. Because they had no reason to think he was lying. They simply smiled politely at me, and continued talking business while I stood there, holding a tray that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. As far as everyone in that room was concerned, they had just been introduced to a member of the household staff. They smiled politely and thanked me for the drinks, and continued discussing as if nothing had happened. My husband joined the conversation without hesitation. He didn't glance in my direction. They kept talking as I quietly walked away. I found a small service corridor behind the ballroom and leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't crying, I was trying to understand how a marriage could change so much that the man who once introduced me with pride had erased me from his life with a single sentence. After a few minutes, the catering manager found me. "There you are," she said kindly. "Could you take another tray of champagne into the ballroom? They're about to make the welcome toast." I nodded. She had no idea who I was. She thought I was one of her staff. I took the tray and walked back inside. As I crossed the room, I caught pieces of different conversations. "The housekeeper is very efficient. She keeps everything running smoothly." Each compliment landed like another wound. Not because they were insulting me but because they were praising a lie. Then came a moment I knew I would never forget. One of the investors raised his glass and smiled at my husband. "You've done well for yourself," he said. "A beautiful home, a successful company, loyal staff." He paused before asking the question that should have had the simplest answer in the world. "And your wife? Is she here tonight?" I stopped walking. Without turning around, I waited to hear what my husband would say. I simply wanted to know whether he would finally tell the truth. The investor smiled as he repeated the question. "And your wife? Is she here tonight?" There was a brief silence. Then my husband chuckled. "My wife doesn't really enjoy these kinds of events." The men around him nodded knowingly. "She's a very private person," he continued. "She prefers staying out of the spotlight." He had erased me so completely that he could stand less than 20 feet away from me and pretend I didn't exist. I quietly carried the tray back into the service area. I placed the empty glasses on the counter, untied the apron around my waist, and folded it neatly beside the sink. One of the caterers looked at me in confusion. "Are you feeling all right?" I smiled politely. "I won't be needing this anymore." I walked into the staff changing room, picked up my handbag, and changed back into the dress I had planned to wear that evening. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Not because she looked different. Because something inside her had changed. 9 years of loyalty, 9 years of sacrifice, and 9 years of believing we were building the same dream. All of it had been reduced to a single lie told in front of a room full of strangers. I didn't go back to the ballroom. I didn't confront him. I simply walked out through the front entrance of the hotel, handed my parking ticket to the valet, and drove away. For the first time since the day we got married, I wasn't driving home. I was driving away from it. I didn't answer any of his calls that night. By the time I reached my sister's house, my phone had rung more than 20 times. His messages started with confusion. "Where are you?" A few minutes later, they became impatient. "The investors are asking where you went." Then they became annoyed. "You embarrassed me by leaving without saying anything." I stared at the screen for a long time before turning my phone off. Embarrassed him? I had spent an entire evening pretending to be someone else's employee because the man I married was ashamed to call me his wife. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking about how he felt. I started thinking about myself. The next morning, I drove back to the house while I knew he would be at work. It was strangely quiet. The same kitchen where we used to laugh over cheap instant coffee. The same dining table where we had planned our future when we had almost nothing. Every room was filled with memories that suddenly felt like they belonged to another couple. I packed one suitcase. Not because I was leaving forever. Because I needed enough distance to hear my own thoughts. As I was about to close the bedroom wardrobe, something caught my eye. On the top shelf was an old cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs from our first apartment. There was one of us sitting on the floor eating takeaway because we couldn't afford a dining table. At the bottom of the box was a faded birthday card he had written during our second year of marriage. I opened it slowly. In his messy handwriting were the words, "One day, when everyone knows my name, I hope they also know yours, because none of this would exist without you." I read the sentence over and over again. The man who had written those words was the same man who looked a room full of strangers in the eye and called me his housekeeper. I folded the card carefully and placed it inside my handbag, picked up my suitcase, and walked out of the house without looking back. 3 days passed before he finally found me. He didn't come to apologize. He came to convince me I had overreacted. He walked into my sister's living room looking exhausted, but the first thing he said wasn't, "I'm sorry." It was, "You left in the middle of the biggest night of my career." I looked at him in disbelief. "You introduced me as your housekeeper." He immediately shook his head. "You've taken it out of context." I only said it because the investors are old-fashioned. They expect successful executives to have a certain image. If they thought I had married someone who spent her days managing the house, they might not have taken me seriously. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So your solution was to pretend I wasn't your wife?" It was only for one evening, as if humiliation had an expiry date. He paced across the room, trying to explain himself. "You know how important that contract is. Once everything was signed, I was going to tell them the truth. I stared at him. You were going to tell them the truth after making me serve them drinks all night? He opened his mouth but couldn't answer. For the first time, he seemed to realize how his own words sounded. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the old birthday card I had found in the wardrobe. Without saying anything, I handed it to him. He recognized it immediately. His expression changed as he read it. When he finished, he lowered the card slowly. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us said far more than any argument ever could. He looked at me in tears. I meant every word. I know, I replied. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reminded myself of the years we had struggled together, the extra jobs I worked, the nights I stayed awake helping him prepare presentations, and the jewelry I sold so he could attend his first business conference. None of those sacrifices had ever hurt me. What hurt was realizing that somewhere along the way, the man who had once been proud to call me his wife became ashamed to do it. He quietly admitted he had never stopped loving me. I believed him. But love wasn't what had broken us. Respect was. For the first time, he understood that saying, "I'm sorry," couldn't undo what he had taken away. Over the next few weeks, he tried everything to win me back. Flowers arrived almost every morning. Then came handwritten letters and old photographs from the happiest years of our marriage. When we finally met, he didn't make excuse. He simply admitted that no business deal, no investor, and no amount of success had been worth losing me. As I listened, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The pain had slowly become acceptance. When he asked if there was still a chance for us, I gently shook my head. Some apologies heal the heart. They don't just save the marriage. A few months later, our divorce was finalized. There were no long court battles or angry arguments. By then, we both knew the marriage had ended the night he introduced me as his housekeeper. As I packed the last of my things, I looked around the home we had built together. Every room reminded me of the years we had struggled side by side, believing we were building the same dream. People often ask if I regret leaving. I always give the same answer. I don't regret helping him become successful. I only regret the day he became ashamed to call me his wife. Love didn't disappear from our marriage. Respect did. And once that was gone, there was nothing left to save.